Hey, welcome to The Conversation. My name is Kyle, and I am coming to you from the First Colony Church of Christ in Sugar Land, Texas. I'm glad that you were here, and I am glad that we are together. We are going to pick up right where we left off. We're going to be in Psalm 15, so go ahead and open your Bibles to Psalm 15. Before we jump into that, though, I have two quick things to mention. First of all, go ahead and log into our chat and say hi. Our moderators have all the answers to all of your questions. And even if you don't have a question, that's totally fine. Just log in and say hi and find some community there in our chat room. And number two, check out the latest episode of our podcast, Anchor Point. Go ahead and check that out. You can find that episode on any podcasting platform, or you can just log onto our website at firstcolonychurch.org and you can listen there. Psalm 15 today. You know what? I have absolutely loved this teaching series. I know that sounds really cliche from someone who teaches a lot, but I got to be honest. I have not spent a lot of my time in the Psalms. I am, and here's the reason why. I'm just going to be honest for a minute. I am very suspicious of my own emotional reactions. I just am. I can be a pretty emotional guy, and I can become an emotional wreck if the situation calls for it. And so throughout the course of my life, I have kept a pretty good check on my emotions. And the reason why I tell you that is because the Psalms seem to be very emotionally driven. They are laments and praises and celebrations and rejoicings and frustrations and things that have scared me in my own life. I don't trust my emotional reaction, and I don't trust my emotions, especially in making decisions. I've been served well by that. I would encourage you to maybe make sure that you don't trust your emotions all that much, but that's another conversation. For me, I have not spent much time in Psalms because of that, because I've seen them as an emotional book and as emotional poems and songs. But in the course of this conversation, in the course of this teaching series, I found myself gravitating more to the Psalms. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But I want to encourage you to find a new flavor for the Psalms. I think there is something of immense importance in that book, and maybe something that we don't always recognize or even give it its just due. Two, I think a great reason of that is I never knew really how to make sense of them. They seemed very sporadic to me, and I know that we're covering a psalm at a time here on the conversation, and we're not really going in any particular order. We're not covering every psalm, but we're going to cover a handful or two of the psalms. But I think maybe giving you some greater insight into these psalms, and at least in the ones we're talking about, I hope that you find a new appreciation for them, like I've done. And I've done this for a long time. I've studied, I've taught discipleship groups and led small groups and delivered messages and sermons. I've done all that stuff, but I think for now, for me, this has been a new season in study and in teaching that I just did not see coming. So I want to encourage you to find your way back to the Psalms. If you've never done so, I think you'll find that they are immensely important. Today we're going to look at Psalm 15. Now, Psalm 15 is well, hang on. I don't want to give everything away right here at the front, but Psalm 15 is a pretty powerful psalm, and it packs a punch for only being 5 verses long. So we're going to read it together. We're going to start in Psalm 15. We're going to start in verse 1, and we're going to read all 5 verses. So hold on. It's not going to take very long, but I want you to read along with me. I'm going to be reading from the New International Version. Here we go. Psalm 15, verse 1. Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary, and who may live on your holy mountain? Verse 2. He whose walk is blameless and who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from his heart and has no slander on his tongue, who does no wrong, or who does his neighbor no wrong, and casts no slur on his fellow man, who despises a vile man, but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps his oath even when it hurts, who lends his money without usury and who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be shaken. Now, at the top of this psalm, it says that it is a psalm of David. That's a really long sentence, by the way, between verses 2 and 5. It's one long answer to a very short but pretty important question. Let's kind of break some of this apart for a minute. So when you get to verse 1 of Psalm 15, it has what Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher and pastor, referred to as the great question. The great question. This is what he said in his commentary on Psalms. He said, this question is asked by idle curiosity. It's asked by despair. It's asked by godly fear, by the earnest enquirer. This is all a quote, by the way. And it's asked by a soul troubled by the falls of others. And it's asked by holy faith. In other words, this is the question. Who can abide and live and approach God? Who can do that? I mean, the enormity of that question, I don't even think we have to labor here very long, because there's an implication of that question that God is so magnificent and he's so real and he's so holy and he has such high ethical standards that when you begin to understand the Lord, even with just a little bit of information, you begin to wonder if anybody can approach God. Who can do this? And so David writes this psalm. Now, theologians and scholars believe that David wrote this psalm as he was watching the Ark of the Covenant be moved to the place where it would reside eventually in the temple. In the movement of that Ark of the Covenant, David begins to see or feel an overwhelming sense about God and the propriety of the movement of the Ark and how it had certain restrictions, who couldn't touch it, how it had to be carried, where it could be, who all could see it at certain times of the year. Those things are quite strict. And so when David begins to understand the requirements of the holiness and the holy lifestyle of the person who is interacting with the Ark of the Covenant, he, according to theologians and scholars, this is what he asks when he sees that. Now, we don't know that for sure. It's an assumption, because there is this transference of sanctuary and the holy mountain or the holy hill, the place where the temple is going to be. The sanctuary is like a code word. It's a layover word from temple, and it kind of the tabernacle, and it kind of refers to the temple. And anyway, all these things to David are remarks about the holiness of God. And so David is not asking a rhetorical question. He's looking at the holiness of God, and he's saying, who's even worthy of this? And so this is what Charles Spurgeon called the great question. It's the great question. So what we find here in the answer to this question, there's a couple of things here that I think are worth noting. There are some theologians that say when you walk through this, you'll be able to find 10 characteristics of the person who can abide in God's sanctuary and live on his mountain. Now, a lot of people think that maybe these 10 characteristics, or at least early theologians, we're talking hundreds of years ago, assumed that there were 10 of these characteristics because they equaled the 10 commandments. But later theologians and scholars, especially those in the 20th and the 21st century, begin to think that maybe there are 10 for a much simpler reason. It's one for each finger. So if you count them off, you can walk through each of these 10. In other words, it was designed to be some sort of curriculum or teaching tool. I'm going to run through these, and we're going to put them in categories in just a minute, and then I'm going to tell you why Psalm 15 is so important. So let me give you all 10 of these. You can just start counting them off. The first one is the person who can live and dwell with God is someone who walks with integrity or who walks blamelessly. That is an incredible word in the Old Testament because it means that word blameless or without blemish is actually the same word used for sacrifices in the Old Testament. So a sacrifice had to be without blemish. So the fact that this is put here in this in these characteristics gives you some sort of idea about where this is going. So that's the first one. The second one is the person. It's the person who does what is right. So whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous. That's number two. This idea of righteousness is doing righteousness. It's not just thinking about righteous. It's not just talking about it. It's actually actively participating in the righteousness and the righteous lifestyle that God requires. This idea of blameless and without blemish. The third characteristic here, if we're going through all 10, the third one is that this person speaks truth in his heart. He speaks truth in his heart. This is a rather poetic phrase that has not necessarily a banal meaning. This kind of means that there is a correspondence between thoughts and actions, that there is they're not prone to hypocrisy, that there is they're not given sway to flattery. It doesn't mean that truth is subjective, though. It doesn't mean that, nor does it mean that you have a license, or this person has a license to say anything that's on their heart. It just means that there is a balance between what is required. So you're probably kind of getting a sense of where this is going, but let's just keep going here. Number four, the fourth one says that this person has no slander on his tongue. This word for slander, it actually means literally to spy out. And it kind of means that the person who is worthy of living this life, of approaching God, does not go seek things to destroy other people. In other words, you are not engaged in a cancel culture lifestyle. You're not looking for things to harm other people. You are not looking for things to hurt reputations or to hurt occupations. The fifth and the sixth characteristics are somewhat related in verse 3. This person does no evil to his neighbor or casts no slur to his fellow man. These are pretty incredible characteristics here, because especially with the idea of speaking, slurring someone, this literally means that you don't taunt someone, that you are not in a situation where you are raising up bad or untruthful things about those in your social circle. In other words, doing this would actually, if someone did this, it not only cast aspersions on this person, but it robs them of the opportunity to participate holistically in a community. You are hindering relationships, and you are hindering the ability to flourish in these lifestyles. Not only that, you are also participating in systems of oppression. So these two are related. They're very relationally related. You don't talk bad about your neighbor, and you don't do wrong to any of your neighbors. The seventh characteristic, this person, the person who can live in the sanctuary of God and on the mountain of God, is this. Is the person is one in whose eyes a vile person, or who despises a vile man but honors those who fear the Lord. In other words, you have to check your heroes, right? You have to check your heroes. You are not modeling your life after people who are ultimately dishonoring God with their lifestyles. So you are dishonoring, you are disavowing people who are overtly evil, and you are honoring people who fear the Lord, those people that might not have the same worldly reputation, but because of the fruit in their life that they are glorifying God with their lifestyle. The eighth characteristic is in verse 4. It's the one who keeps his oath even when it hurts. I love that translation in the NIV. It's translated rather clumsily, I think, in other translations, but this one kind of spells it all out. In other words, your honor is more important than anything else. And if you find yourself in a situation where it would be easy to lie or deceive your way out of that situation, that disqualifies you from being able to participate in the lifestyle, in the access of God. This is pretty critical. So that's the eighth one. Here's the ninth one. This is this person who can live with God and have access to God lends his money without usury. This doesn't mean that you can't lend money without interest payments. It means that you can't unfairly do that. There were tremendous practices during the era in which the psalm was written that sometimes people would loan money with interest rates of 25 to 30%. We have actual archaeological historical records of that. So that is an unfair. You are hurting people's livelihood and situations where they can benefit their family by overburdening them with interest payments on loans. Also, you know this, every seventh year loans were forgiven anyway. So the point being is that someone who wants this kind of access to God cannot hurt people with money. And finally, the final characteristic here is someone who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. You'll find this in the Old Testament, and especially in the culture surrounding the Old Testament. But there were often times when people who lived in poverty were exploited by wealthier people. That doesn't sound at all familiar, does it? It happens today as well. But there was a serious prohibition against that. If you want to have unfettered access to God, then you cannot exploit people who live in poverty. So all 10 of these, remember there are 10 of them. It's one for each finger. So children could understand exactly what this meant. All this being said, at the end of this, there's this tremendous promise, right? He who does these things will never be shaken. You'll never be moved. Honor and integrity has an extreme consequence. But where are you going to be moved from? Well, what that means is you will continue to have access to God. Now, all that's great, right? It almost sounds like when I was reading through this week and doing some research, the more I read about it, the more it felt like that this would be what maybe a great coach would give his or her team at halftime. It's a great halftime speech, right? You got to live right. You got to do right. You got to talk right. You got to speak right. You got to deal with people the right way. If you want to do that, you're going to win, right? I've participated in some of those high octane halftime talks from coaches. That's kind of what this sounds like. And it kind of coaches you up and it preaches you up and it makes you feel good until reality sets in, right? Let me ask you a really honest question. How many of these have you broken in the past 24 hours? How many? Yeah, you see what I mean? Here's the secret. This is an impossible list to keep. Now, the flavor of our lives can be that we are people of integrity. We do the right thing. There is that, right? We can live our lives in such a way that we do not bring a stain upon the church and upon Jesus. We know that we sin, that we fall, that we're forgiven. We live lives of integrity. But the literal Q&A here in this psalm makes this an impossible list to keep. We can't do it for 24 hours. Let's look at this in context. I think this is going to give us a sense of where we are. For that, we got to go back to Psalm 14, one chapter over. I think it's important to see Psalm 15 in the context in which it was written. And this is what I was That's what I was sharing with you earlier. I've found a new appreciation for the Psalms, listening to the context of where they are placed. So, in Psalm 14, verse 1, it says this: "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." In other words, Psalm 14, verse 1, calls the atheist a fool. Now, those of us who believe in God, we feel like we have an aha moment, right? That we can say that everyone who disagrees with us are fools, but you got to read the rest of the psalm for that, right? We're in Psalm 14, because what's amazing about what the psalmist writes in verse 1 is that it encompasses even me and you, right? Listen to this. Verse 1, "The fool says in his heart there's no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile." And listen to this: "There is no one who does good." No one. No one does good. This is not necessarily an insult to us. What it is an incredibly astute description of our lives before God. None of us are good. None of us are. Listen, if you think that's an anomaly, it keeps going. Verse 2 in chapter 14, "The Lord looks down from heaven on the sons of men to see if there is any who understand, any who seek God." Listen to verse 3, "All have turned aside and have together become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one." So before we get all giddy about our place in the world in reference to Psalm 14, verse 1, we need to make sure that we read the rest of the psalm to realize that there is an impartial judgment here. None of us are good. And in some ways, in most ways, in all ways, because of the way that we dishonor God, that dishonoring is a way of saying, there is no God. I can do whatever I want. That's Psalm 14. Psalm 15, we realize that we are not good, that there is no goodness in us. So we get to this question in Psalm 15 of who can access God, who can live on his mountain, who can live in his sanctuary. And then we read through all of these 10 characteristics, and we realize that Psalm 15 describes the person that you and I are not, nor will we ever be. Feels like we've been beat up by the time we read through this, because we read chapter 14 and we realize who we are, and then we get to chapter 15 and it feels like there is some salt in our wounds until we get to Psalm 16. Listen to this. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Psalm 16. Let's read in verse 1. This is the answer to Psalm 15, verse 1. Psalm 16, verse 1, listen to this. "Keep me safe. Keep me safe, God. For in you I take refuge. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good thing. As for the saints who are in the land, they are the glorious ones in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those will increase who run after other gods. I will not pour out their libations of blood or take up their names on my lips, because you have assigned me my portion and my cup, and you have made my lot secure." Verse 16 answers the question, chapter 16 answers the question of chapter 15. It's this astounding psalm. In fact, it's the psalm we're going to talk about next week because it is so critical to the New Testament, to our introduction of Jesus. We take our refuge in God. There is no good apart from you, Lord. There is none. I am like the atheist. I am a fool. I am no good. I do not meet any of the descriptions in Psalm 15. I can't do any of these faithfully, but it's in you that I find my goodness. I find my worth. And you know what? These things are possible. If you have your Bibles, we're going to go to the New Testament now, to 2 Peter chapter 1. I want you to listen to 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Grace and peace be yours in abundance through the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, since his divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Through these, he has given us very great and precious promises, that so through them you may participate in the divine nature and escape the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. Our ability to live lives of integrity is non-existent without the divine power given to us through Jesus. It all hangs on Jesus. Everything hangs on Jesus. When I realized that, in especially looking at the Psalms, I realized that everything points to Jesus. There is no way. When I read Psalm 15 on its own, I realize I can't do this. If I'm going to be honest, I cannot live that sort of life of integrity on my own. I am an abject failure. But through the divine power of God given to us through the resurrection of Jesus, I can do these things. Supernaturally, miraculously, I can turn away from my own sinful nature and live a life of integrity. You know what? You can too. That's the greatness of this psalm. That's the greatness of this psalm and its context. Between chapter 14 and chapter 16, we find this unimaginable, beautiful picture of Jesus when we see our own inability to be what Psalm 15 wants us to be. David would admit that. He would admit that. The entire story of the Old Testament would admit that. They could not, as a collective group of people, live holy lives. You know what? Here's the left hook in all this. If you and I could do this, if we could completely live the way that Psalm 15 says, then there is no need for Jesus. There's no need for Jesus. Jesus makes that possible. He makes it possible. I told you, just good stuff. We're going to be in Psalm 16 next week. Go ahead and do some homework, read the rest of it. And if you want to do some more homework, Google it. Find out where it's referenced in the New Testament. I don't think I've ever given you homework here in the conversation, but that's a little bit. If you want to do some private Bible study this week, go ahead and find where Psalm 16 is used in the New Testament. It's going to be some good stuff. Thanks for joining me today. It's been a great Sunday. If you're catching this on the replay, whatever day it is, it's been a great day. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again here next week.